It's funny hearing that. I was reminded that when I was little, in our household, there were a couple things that weren't allowed. So one of them is you were not allowed to be rude. My parents called it don't be feisty. So I now say that to my son, and he says, I'm not feisty, I'm tasty. And then we weren't allowed to watch anything with magic in it. No Smurfs. I don't even know if there was magic. Someone once gave us these little chocolates that were Smurf chocolates, and my mom took a long time to consider if we should eat them or not. And we weren't allowed to have sugar cereal. But I remember reading this as a kid, and I often thought that what was sprinkled on the ground was Frosted Flakes. I was pretty good. Then, as an adult, I tasted it, and I was like, definitely not. So the book of Exodus gives us this metaphorical picture of what it means to be free, and of all of the ways that our freedom is a moment in time, is all of the ways that we think freedom is a moment in time rather than many moments in time. And last week we were reminded that freedom is a process of where we are going, and where we will finally be. And we insisted that we are a new creation, we are being made a new creation, and we will become a new creation. And that the same can be said for freedom. It is both here and it is on the way. In the Exodus, we're at the point where the people have found themselves on the other side of an impossible situation where they were stuck between the enemy that wanted to devour them and the sea that they were sure was going to consume them. And they found themselves between these two impossible situations. And everything within them suggested that bondage was better than freedom. And then God made a way to the other side. And for a brief moment, for a very small window of time, their faith is restored. Their belief that they were created for liberation is reinstated, and they are ready yet again to embrace what is ahead of them and let go of what is behind them. Freedom is starting to feel free. This is so evident that they burst out into song and they declare that God has fought for them and they have won. Freedom is theirs. That is until they get a little bit hungry and a little bit thirsty. But before we get there, I want us to go all the way back to Genesis, where we are first introduced to God's vision for the world. A world where there is harmony and abundance and interdependence. From Abraham's invitation to go to Canaan, to their promise of a son, to the story of Jacob's expanding family and Joseph's capacity to provide abundance to both Egypt and his own family, despite the drought and the famine that surrounds them. Surprising abundance seems to be the way of God. But Brueggemann suggests that it is here, as we encounter the Pharaoh, that we're introduced into a new mindset. A mindset that the Pharaoh suggests is scarcity. There is not enough. Let's get everything. And it is there that the people effectively move from learning from a God who insists that abundance is a way of being, and we enter 4+ centuries of lessons that insist the opposite, that there just isn't enough to go around. And Brueggemann says that Exodus records the contest between the liturgy of generosity and the myth of scarcity, a contest that still tears us apart today. And I want you to think about something, anything that has been a long-held belief, a value, and a way of being that is a thread within your family. Something that perhaps your grandmother passed on to your parent that has now been passed on to you, that you hope to pass on to your own family. Whether it's religious or cultural or moralistic, there are things that kind of thread us together with the generations that go before us. And then I want you to imagine what 400 years or 8+ generations of experiencing the opposite of that value, of that belief, or of that understanding, what it would do to your own formation, to your own self-concept, and to your own ideology. Essentially, that thread, that thing that kind of linked the generations together, would dissolve in the midst of an incessant reminder that what you believe to be true does not actually work. And I want to suggest that that's where we find Israel in the book of Exodus. The decades, the centuries of observing that there is more than enough, that God is their provider, that there is a way of living and operating that makes sure that there's enough for everyone, gets diluted year after year, decade after decade, and century after century. Because now they live in a new world with a new way of seeing. And so although the history is one of abundance and provision, for 400 years, that has been wiped out and it gets replaced with the reminder that there just might not be enough. There might not be enough food, and there's probably not going to be enough space. There might not be enough work completed, and there might not be enough done to maintain peace. There might not be enough for everyone. And this change in thinking has shifted who they are right down to the way that their brains are wired, their nervous systems respond, and their ideas about God are formed. And it is these people with these brains and with these mindsets that find themselves on the other side of the sea. In 400 years, they have learned that leaders take for themselves first. That when the food is finished, it is actually finished. That if you don't harvest enough, there won't be enough. If you don't gather enough, there won't be more to gather later. That the God of their ancestors, who spoke of great abundance as a way of being, is not the God that they have experienced. And we are reminded once again that being made free does not make us free. Their bodies may be free, but their minds are not. And relearning abundance when you have been conditioned for scarcity is not as easy as 1, 2, 3. And so when they find themselves at a body of water that is somehow unfit to drink, it doesn't matter that they have seen other miracles before. It doesn't matter that there is this actual physical representation of God in their midst in the form of a pillar of fire and a cloud. It doesn't matter that they've walked out of Pharaoh's control and oppression. It doesn't matter that they have found themselves on the other side of an impossible situation. In that moment, their minds go back to bondage. And they are certain that there will not be enough. And they spiral into an imagination that they are going to die of thirst, that Moses has led them into the wilderness to die, that God has forgotten them, and then the God who created them, and that the God who created them for abundance has left them behind. But then this God, from the very beginning, that insisted that the world could be ordered in a way where there is enough for everyone. That God makes the water clear to drink. And the people are reminded that while the system they came from said there is not enough, the God that they worship out in the wilderness is a God of abundance. And if you go ahead too quickly, you might not catch that if they had waited just a little while more, they would have seen that what was up just ahead of them was the oasis of Elim, 12 springs of fresh water, 70 palm trees with food and shade, and God had already been walking them towards a place where there was enough for everyone. But their minds, they're not free enough to believe that this is for real. Later, in chapter 17, they will stop in a specific place, and it is as if the experience of God's provision that was behind them is completely forgotten. And once again, they are certain that God has brought them to the wilderness to die. When suddenly, with a tap of his staff on a rock, God, through Moses, pours out water for all of them to drink. Once again, there's enough for everyone, but it was the fear of not enough that consumed them. Freed bodies does not mean freed minds. But we know water is not enough to sustain us, especially when you're walking through the wilderness. And they can remember when they were in bondage that although it was hard and although it was challenging and although it was oppressive and life-draining, at least they had food to eat. They turned to Moses and they announced, "We used to eat all of the meat we wanted. We had all of the bread we could ask for. The produce was delightful. The fish were plentiful. And you have brought us here to die." And once again, the fear that there will not be enough for everyone rises to the surface. And the response from God to the people is that the heavens will open and food will come directly from the hand of God to the people of Israel. In the morning, there will be bread to eat. In the evening, there will be quail to dine on. There's going to be enough. And Scripture says that some collected small and others collected much, but there was enough for everyone. But the fear of not enough continued to consume them. Their bodies were free, but their minds were still stuck in the ways and the practices and the ideas of the Pharaoh of their time. And so some of them chose the false trust of hoarding versus the freedom of insisting that there's enough for everyone. But for those who hoarded, their stored up food would mold, maggots would take over it, and would rot right in front of them. And slowly, so slowly, their minds are beginning to follow the freedom that their physical bodies have already experienced. And they are reminded that the way of their God is not the way of the Pharaoh. Where Pharaoh insisted you had to make sure some struggled in order to ensure you had abundance, God is demonstrating that there's enough for all of them to experience abundance. And this message is so clearly outlined that God sets up this collection in such a way that there's even a day to rest. In preparation for the Sabbath, you could collect more, and the more that you would collect would last so that one day a week you could rest. This is the greatest act of defiance against the way of a former taskmaster, as they pause weekly and still discover that they have enough. God's way is that abundance, the idea of enough for everyone, is so certain and specific that even in the rhythm of pause and rest, there is enough for everyone. This same principle is repeated as Moses leads and finds himself being burnt out because he does all of the work on his own. And it's his father-in-law who says, "No, that is the scarcity mindset. Look around you. There are leaders everywhere. There are people among you who can share the workload. There's more than enough for everyone." When the Israelites go into their first battle and they find they are winning, and I just want you to erase all of the questions about this. Just go with my theme, okay? So when the Israelites, just take them out, just remove them. So when the Israelites go into their first battle and find they are winning when Moses' hands are raised and losing when Moses' hands droop down. And then the people come and they hold up Moses' hands so they can fight and win. And we are reminded yet again that the message is clear. The message is repeated. There is more than enough for everyone. From physical sustenance to the community's capacity to care for and support those beside them and those who lead them. If you do have questions, I invite you to go back 2 sermons ago, and your answers are there. And moment by moment, Israel is moving from being made free to being ones who both experience freedom and are free as the threads that held their ancestors together, the threads that formed them as a people and shaped their ideas about God and others, are being reformed and re-strengthened as they come to recognize that from the beginning, to know what God is like, to understand who God is, and thus how one should engage with those around them and beside them, it is essential to reframe one's idea from the myth of scarcity which is the lesson of the Pharaoh, to what Brueggemann calls the liturgy of abundance, which was the way that God intended all things to be from the beginning. And they take one more step towards freedom. And we are reminded that in our own quest to be free, in our own desire to no longer be shaped by the powers and ideologies of our modern pharaohs, we too must find ways to relearn this basic idea that there is more than enough for everyone. But to live as though we are created for this abundance when we have been conditioned for scarcity is not as easy as 1, 2, 3. Now, at this church, we often talk about the invitation that comes from God to humanity to participate in the renewal of all things, which is very much a picture of all things being brought back to the way they were intended in the beginning, co-creators of a more just and a more beautiful world. But although we recognize this invitation and perhaps can even identify the ways that this invitation will contribute to our freedom and the freedom of others, it is very difficult to let go of all of the ways we have been formed by our modern day pharaohs, because we are unsure if the invitation to follow the way of Jesus can be trusted. Because the tools look different, the outcomes are not the same, success is defined differently, and the method seems so countercultural that we are not sure that this new way of being can sustain us along the way. And we find ourselves as ones who are free who may not be freed. And while there are so many examples of how this plays out in our everyday lives, it so often shows up for us in the ways that it showed up for Israel in the Exodus, where we are celebrating when it seems that following the way of Jesus is going to help us to rise, but terrified that the God who was enough when we were celebrating will somehow leave us in need when it matters most. Fear becomes our driving force as we become like those who, rather than trusting that there would be manna for tomorrow, begin hoarding what God promised would daily be provided. It is there that saving turns to hoarding, profit turns to gouging, and enough seems to be this imaginary idea or an impossible ideal. And suddenly we find ourselves operating in and justifying the ways of Pharaoh rather than being formed and transformed and made free by leaning into the ways of Jesus. Brueggemann says it like this. He says, the great question now facing the church is whether our faith allows us to live in a new way. Does your faith allow you to live in a new way? Will our faith allow us to live in ways that insist the water we drink and the air we breathe will remain an available resource for those who come after us? Will our faith allow us to live in ways to ensure that there are equitable opportunities for those who are so easily left out and those so easily overlooked? Will our faith allow us to live in ways that allow generosity to define us and to shape those around us? Will our faith allow us to live in ways where we choose not just to share material things, but also the power we hold and the privileges that we carry? Will our faith allow us to let go of values and deeply held beliefs that dismiss the stories and the personhood and the needs of those around us? Will our faith allow us to live in ways where we respond to that which disenfranchises our neighbors, even if it costs us? Will our faith allow us to live as ones who recognize that exhausted is not the requirement? Will our faith allow us the courage to share the load with others, to lean into those around us, and to be supported by others along the way? Will our faith allow us to live as though there is enough for everyone? Enough love for our enemies, enough forgiveness even for ourselves, enough rest to avoid exhaustion, enough community to share both joy and sorrow, enough opportunity that means it's okay to say no, and enough wisdom to be guided that it's okay to say yes. Enough resources to ensure that there is more for tomorrow, enough time to insist we can pause and slow down. Enough mercy to extend to others, enough peace to make reconciliation a priority, enough space to make room for one more. Enough that we need not hoard what we have been given or be afraid to accept what we have been offered, or terrified to invite others to partake and participate in the vision of enough for everyone. It really is a new way of being and a radically different way of seeing, but somehow, even those of us who wonder if the God who carried us through on the dry ground to the other side can actually be trusted to provide us and those around us with enough. Even we, the scared and the fearful, know that it is here, in the living and the breathing and the offering of abundance, that we become just a little bit more free. Each time we defy scarcity by insisting that there is enough for us and for them and for everyone, we multiply that which makes us free as we begin in our own small ways to insist that freedom is not just for a few, but is intended to be for us all. Rochelle, you can come back up. We have been made free, and we are being made free. We will be free. Free to let go of the way of our modern day pharaohs. Free to be formed by the way of Jesus. Free to co-create a more just and beautiful world for all, and free to participate in the renewal of all things. Made free to be ones who multiply freedom. The good news is this: freedom is both here and freedom is on the way. Let's stand together. Amen. Let there be freedom. It is very easy for us to be consumed by the way of the Pharaoh. One of the greatest examples of that is the way that we look at the Sermon on the Mount. That was going to be my sermon, and I changed it at the last minute. But this is how the way we look at this. So I'm still giving it to you. It was the way that we look at the Sermon of the Mount and find all of the ways to evade and dismiss it because it doesn't quite fit with the way of the Pharaoh. And yet here we are, invited into a new way of being and a new way of living where we get to participate with God. Not for unrealistic ideals, but with the opportunity to participate in change happening where we are, with who we encounter, and the places where we are already planted. So as we go into this week and we find spaces and places where we are hearing that there is not enough, may we take on the mantra that comes from all of Scripture that reminds us that there is more than enough. There is enough for everyone.